All right. We are now live for yet another monthly session of Understanding Anger 2.0. This time we are going to be talking about the works of a great Middle Platonist figure who some of you may know from biographies, and that is Plutarch, who did, in fact, write a whole bunch of parallel lives, which are really cool. We're not going to talk about those here, although I think there'd be plenty of room down the line to revisit Plutarch and talk about how anger plays out in those biographies. But today we are going to be talking about his philosophy. And as it turns out, he has an entire book on controlling anger, and we'll talk plenty about that. But he's got some other works that are relevant as well. So before we get started, and as people are showing up, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on this series, and then we'll do a little bit of background on Plutarch as well. So Understanding Anger 2.0, why is it 2.0? Because we did a previous live in-person version of this. It's actually I think, yeah, it is 10 years ago that we did it at the Kingston Public Library. That was the year that we moved here to Milwaukee. So originally we were going to do 12 sessions on ancient and medieval theories, literature on anger, and we only got to 10 before we moved here to Milwaukee. So we didn't get to everyone that we wanted to. And I've been teaching classes at Marquette University and Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design, focused specifically for an entire semester on different literary, philosophical, theological, psychological treatments of anger. And people started saying, hey, could you do some for us, the wider world of the internet? And I thought, yeah, why not? Let's do that. So we've been doing this for quite a while. We've covered a number of literary sources in ancient philosophy, in ancient culture. We've looked at quite a few ancient philosophical sources, including spending 3 sessions on Seneca's book on anger. We've talked about Platonists, Epicureans, Cicero, Aristotle, the Stoics. Now we're coming back to Platonism once again. And I will mention that I am once again this semester teaching a class at Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design on anger and justice. And we just covered Plutarch a couple weeks ago. Students found his stuff pretty interesting. Hopefully you will as well. And we're actually going to do a little bit of a deeper dive in this session than I did with my students, because we only looked at that one book on controlling anger. So let me jump in and tell you about Plutarch, Middle Platonism, and then we'll actually start looking at what's in his very rich texts. So Plutarch is what we call a Middle Platonist, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. So, obviously early, late, middle comes in between. So he's not a Neoplatonist. A lot of people, I think, in the philosophy world know about that movement. Middle Platonism is sandwiched in between there, and Plutarch, along with certain other figures, is a major representative of that. Plutarch himself is born and lives for the most part of his life in Kairouneia in Greece. He comes from a fairly well-to-do family, enough to have a private library, to be able to travel to Rome. He's born in 46 Common Era, dies in about 120. Studies in Athens at the relocated academy, which is Plato's school, which by now has passed through ancient skepticism, academic skepticism, and is back to Middle Platonism, which is a rather eclectic movement. And Plutarch himself is a Roman citizen, or rather becomes a Roman citizen. He serves as a priest of Apollo at Delphi, participated in local political affairs, had a lot of really interesting dinner parties involving serious conversations, some of which probably were him workshopping his ideas. And he's best known again for his biographies, which are parallel lives, but he's got a lot of other great stuff, which is assembled under the title Moralia. And the Moralia are a bunch of different essays about a number of different topics in philosophy. So we mentioned Middle Platonism. So what is that? The Platonic Academy that Plato founded and then followed by his nephew Speusippus rather than Aristotle. It was literally a case of nepotism, and then some other successors. They took a veering off into skepticism with this guy Arcesilaus, who becomes the scholarch, the leader of the school around 266 before Common Era. And it's going to go on for a while. Cicero encounters them as skeptics like that. And eventually, Philo of Larissa is going to go to Rome, and his student Antiochus of Ascalon, who's the teacher of Cicero, revives the old Platonic Academy. So they're going away from skepticism, and they start becoming very eclectic. They say, well, the Stoics got some stuff that's good. The Aristotelians got some stuff that's good. Let's take on those elements. Plutarch is encountering that as he's studying Platonic philosophy, and he seems to find that quite congenial. It's not simple eclecticism. The basic orientation and superstructure is Platonic, but wherever they can find a good idea in Aristotelians, Platonists, even, Pythagoreans or other schools, they will take that on and incorporate it in their own point of view. And sometimes they'll do things like attribute ideas coming from Aristotle to Socrates, which makes it a little bit more orthodox in their point of view. We even see Plutarch doing that himself. And they're going to change their views on some things like, do people sometimes go wrong and know that they're going wrong? Do they suffer loss or lack of self-control, what we call akrasia? They get that from the Aristotelians, and that changes their stuff. But they're basically Platonic in their moral psychology. So let's talk about that a bit. I won't assume that you already know all about Platonic moral psychology. But, it could be good to do a little refresher for those who do. So Plato thought that the soul had three main parts. You may remember this from our discussion a while back that was devoted to anger and Platonic dialogues. So the top part is the rational part, the intellect, and that's immortal. That's the best part of ourselves. The bottom part are the appetites, the epithumii, the parts that want, eating and drinking and sex and all those sorts of matters, wealth insofar as it leads to those. And those appetites can't really put a brake on themselves. They need the rational part to say, hey, buddy, you've eaten enough, knock it off. But there's a middle part. Thumos is what it's called in Greek. I'll actually put this in the comments just to, make it useful for you. Here's that term. So the thumatic part, that's the part that gets angry. That's the part that gives us the energy and drive that we need to resist threats to ourselves, to orient ourselves against injustice, also to keep our appetites in check. It's supposed to help the rational part. It's aligned with the better parts of ourself, you could say. And so Plato had said this is the way things should work. Plutarch takes that on, and he's going to criticize the Stoics for their position that irrational, excuse me, suffering from some allergies here. Irrational emotional responses are just, screwing up the rational faculty. He says, no, there is a part of ourselves that we need to pay attention to. And so for Plato and for Plutarch, this irascible part is located between the upper part, the lower parts, and it does a lot of important jobs. It can lend its vigor and its force to the rational part. It's located in between them. He even goes so far as to say the thumatic part, its role is to rule and to be ruled. So it should be taking its cues from the rational part, the better part of ourselves, and it should be imposing it on the appetites. And he says, and this is similar to what, the Stoics and Aristotle said, in the soul of a human being, the irascible faculty is not purely passive, but has an imagination of good mixed with the irrational appetite of revenge or retaliation. So this is where we get to, excuse me, this is where we get to talking about what its job is, right? And we talk about this in terms of virtues and vices, the good things about ourselves and the bad things about ourselves. So the general idea is that all of our capacities should be subject to the rational part, but the rational part needs to be fully developed. Reason is able to penetrate, as Plutarch says, through our entire being. Ethical virtue, then, or moral virtue, is the irrational parts being formed by reason and acquiring this quality and differentiation by habit, by ethos in Greek. Reason doesn't want to eliminate our emotions completely. That would not be possible. And even if we could do that, that would be a stupid thing to do. But you want to put some limitations, some order, some structure, some due proportion, as he says, and measure. This is very Platonic, right? And so he says, reason does this by using prudence or practical wisdom to develop the capacity for our emotions into a good acquired disposition. So another way of framing this in terms of anger, our emotion of anger as raw material is not good. It's not necessarily bad, but it can go bad easily. When it's properly informed by reason, it can actually be quite helpful. And so he says that you need three things working together to have perfectly right action. You need human nature, then you need reason, and then you need habit. And by reason, he says, I mean the act of learning. So, there's some teaching and learning going on here. And by habit, constant practice. So we start out with our natural capacities, then we learn, we advance through learning, and then we get the practical use by repetition. And then there's a kind of integration of all of these together. This hopefully makes sense to people. And by the way, you can always ask questions in the comments and chat, and I'll take those up as we go through this. So, and a really interesting feature that I like about virtue ethics that, Plutarch is tied in with, is that there's a focus on real contexts of actual people and relationships over time, not just an ideal abstract situations. He wants to know, like, how do you manage your anger in relation to your neighbors, your spouse, your children, your parents, your brothers and sisters, people in the marketplace. We would say these days, co-workers, or, people that you're thrown in with in other cases. Now, he tells us a couple interesting things about vices. If we can develop virtues, we can also develop vices. And so he's got a book called On Natural Affection Towards One's Offspring. And he says that, we naturally like each other as human beings, particularly if we're connected by familial relationships. But if we develop vices, and this is what happens in a lot of abusive households, that can interfere with our proper development and replace it with something that's actually quite bad. Another thing that he says that I really like, this is in his treatise on virtue and vice. A man cannot write a bill of divorce to his vice and thereby free himself from further trouble and procure his own repose by living apart. it still cohabitates with him and dwells in his very guts and cleaves to him both by day and by night, a burdensome fellow traveler, a chargeable table companion, a troublesome bedfellow, right? So if you've developed bad habits, bad moral habits with respect to your anger, you're kind of bringing an a-hole along with you, a real jerk, whether you like it or not. Of course, that jerk is you. In another piece called A Discourse to an Unlearned Prince, he says that vice, being furnished with wheels by power, sets all the faculties of the soul in a violent fermentation. Of anger, it makes murder, it leads to killing people. Of love, adultery, and of covetousness, the confiscation of other people's goods. So we really do want to figure out whether we're well off or badly off when it comes to our anger, and figure out, how can we make ourselves better? So this is a good segue into this work on controlling anger. And it is a dialogue, not a real dialogue. It's more of a monologue, but the dialogue sets a kind of pretext. So this guy Sulla is talking with another guy, Fundandus, and he says that, Fundandus has changed. So Sulla says, I see the violent and fiery tendency of yours towards anger has become so gentle and submissive in reason. This mildness has brought about no inactivity or feebleness in you, so you haven't become like just weak. But like the earth, when it's been subdued by cultivation, it's received smoothness and depth conducive to fruitful action. It's evident the spirited part of your soul is not withering away. And he's going to ask, well, how did you do this? And so Fundandus will say, thanks for asking. And then that's the rest of the treatise. And so Sola's going to say, it's sort of like medical treatment. What remedy did you use? And Plutarch, through Fundandus, is going to give us a whole bunch of remedies. But before we actually get to the remedies, we need to understand what anger is and how it actually works and what's problematic about anger. So here's some of the really distinctive themes. We're going to start kind of at the top, and then we're going to get more and more granular. So he's got this great line. Neither marriage nor friendship is tolerable if anger is there. Now, he doesn't mean that you should never get angry at each other. What he means is if anger is the main theme running throughout your relationship is going to suck. And you don't want your marriage, or, in our days, committed, personal, romantic relationship. Not everybody gets married like they did in ancient times. Or your friendships. You don't want those to suck, do you? You don't want your relationship with your coworkers to suck. So you really need to pay attention to anger. How do we do this? Well, this is where we need to develop our capacity for thinking. And this is where a lot of people go wrong. They're like, I just get angry. I can't think about this. It's out of my control. And Plutarch would say, oh, I call bullshit on that. And so would every ancient thinker, by the way. So he says that I don't think that reason should be used in the cure as we use hellebore and be washed out of the body together with the disease. It has to remain in the soul, and it keeps watch and ward over our judgments. And he says temper or anger, more than any of the other emotions, tends to, resist reason once it's going. He says it shuts out sense completely and locks it up, like those who burn themselves in their own houses. So what we need to do is the work beforehand. It's not enough to get mad and then be like, okay, I'm going to get a book. What did Plutarch say? By then it's too late. What you really need is to prepare yourself ahead of time. So he actually talks about temper being like a well-fortified tyranny. You have to have its destroyer born and bred in the same household, and that's reason. We also learn over time this kind of how it feels good to assert control over ourselves when we resist and control anger with reason and choice and discipline. So he says, if judgment opposes the fits of anger and represses them, it not only cures them for the present, but it makes the soul better off for the future. You're less liable to get attacked by anger as you're proceeding with these things. And so he says, for my own experience, when I had opposed anger 2 or 3 times, I learned that I didn't have to give into it. I learned that I could resist it, and that made it easier to resist it the next time that it came around. Another key theme that we're going to see is that anger shows us who we are. And we might not like seeing what it reveals about us. So, in the context of relationships, if we're getting angry with our children, with our coworkers, with especially with people who are in a lower position, who are subservient, who are vulnerable, he brings up examples of wives, children, servants, innkeepers, sailors, mule handlers, even animals like dogs and asses that we use for particular things. When somebody is getting angry and lashing out at them, you get to see who that person really is. And he goes on and he says, we really got to be careful not to get angry at other people, even in jest, because that is going to bring hatred in where friendliness was. We should try not to get angry and learn in discussions with each other. And you might think about people talking on the internet about intellectual topics and getting all mad at each other. That turns the love of learning into strife. We should not do it in teaching. When we're teaching and we get angry, what does it do? It makes our students hate learning, right? We shouldn't do it in prosperity. It increases envy. In adversity, it drives away compassion. So anger is pretty dangerous for us. So what can we do? Well, we need to understand the nature of anger and bad temper and irascibility. Now, this is something we talked about previously. What makes us angry? Plutarch is drawing partly on Aristotle and partly on Plato here. Anger, he says, tends to arise from some perception on our part that somebody else is showing us contempt, they're thinking less of us, or that they're neglecting us. And once we start getting angry, we can get angry with anyone and anything. He says we grow angry with enemies and friends, children and parents, even the gods, wild beasts, soulless implements. And he says that anger is a complex emotion. It appears to be a mixture drawn from all of the passions. So what does that mean? This is, again, similar to Aristotle. It's drawn from pain and pleasure. It's also drawn from insolence, and it has envy's malicious joy in the ills of others, but it's worse than envy. What does it want? What is its desire? Not just that it avoids suffering evil, but it can ruin its antagonist. It's a craving to cause pain to somebody else. All of these are parts of the emotion of anger. And he says that what happens when we get angry over and over again? When anger persists for a certain amount of time and outbursts are frequent, irascibility becomes the result of that. And irascibility is a habit. It's a disposition. When we say somebody has a bad temper, when we say that somebody has anger problems, we're talking about what he's calling irascibility. And it produces three, types that he's again referring to Aristotle: rage, moroseness, and peevishness. And these many shocks of anger, he says, are like a chronic cough. So, think about like when you're getting sick, right? Right now, you heard a little bit. I was sneezing, got some drainage going on. Okay, that's not great. I can go blow my nose. I can, take care of that. It's from allergies. Could it get worse? Yeah, all that stuff could like go into my lungs, could give me a sore throat, could give me a headache. And pretty soon, I don't just have allergies, I've got bronchitis, right? And maybe that becomes a permanent condition. Not good for me. Well, that can happen to us with anger, right? That can become part of our character. And he looks at some excuses that people make back then that I think people are still making today, particularly in, macho situations. All these people who talk about like being an alpha, the whole manosphere, and they stress the sort of stuff that Plutarch is targeting back then. He says, here's where people go wrong with anger. Anger is not manly. It's actually a weakness, doesn't have any real quality of pride or greatness. A lot of people think that its turbulence is activity, it's blustering, confident boldness, obstinacy is force of character. Some even claim that its cruelty is magnificence in action, and its unwillingness to be reconciled, its implacability, firmness in resolution, and its moroseness, hatred of evil. But they are wrong in this. So he's saying, I'm calling bullshit. You may tell yourself these things. People around you might tell you these, but these are wrong. This is how you screw yourself up as a human being. Instead, where is anger coming from? Weakness. He says it's especially selfishness, self-centeredness, and peevishness, together with luxury and softness, which beget in us those continuous or oft recurring fits of anger that are gathered together in the soul, little by little, like a swarm of bees or wasps. So think about kids throwing temper tantrums. They don't get the cereal that they want in the grocery store, so they lay on the ground and I'm mad, and their parent is embarrassed, and maybe they knock stuff off the shelves, and you're like, man, that's a crappy kid right there. Hope they don't act like that as an adult. Well, what if they do act like that as an adult? What if, to take a common example, one of the things that happens an awful lot today, it's one reason why a lot of women don't want to, extend themselves in dating situations. Some guy is trying to chat up a woman and he's giving her compliments, and they're not landing because he didn't do any of the work to show her that he has an interest in her other than a sex object. And she's like, get away, creep. I don't like that. And then suddenly he becomes angry. And then he says stuff like, oh, you're fat, or, nobody would want to date you anyway. And you're like, wow, what a pathetic loser. And you're looking at it from the outside. He's trying to save his ego, but he's looking like a jackass. This is exactly what Plutarch is talking about. And we can think about people who don't get their way in the workplace, people who don't get their way in other things. They're selfish. They don't really have a developed character. And he says that, there's things that we can be, you could say, weak in relation to, that can put us at a disadvantage when it comes to anger. So, for example, the glutton with his cook. If you're kind of fastidious about, you need food a certain way and it's not that way, and now you get all mad, that's a weakness. That's a failure on your part. A jealous man with his wife, I don't want to see you talking to anybody else. Oh, really? So we're going to do a home remodeling and you don't want me talking with the contractor because he's a guy? You got some serious problems. A conceited person, when they've been, talked about, he says, in every case, what we've got is pain and suffering caused generally by weakness. And then we get this outburst of passion. So if that isn't well regulated, then we're going to have problems. Now, David asks a good question here, and it's going to be a complicated answer. Does Plutarch believe that anger is a normal reaction? Normal reaction to what? So we can't talk about it being a normal reaction per se. We got to say, yes, when a person thinks that they have been shown contempt, neglect, that they didn't get what they want, it is normal for them to get angry. But we have to ask, well, normal in what sense? Is it normal to throw a temper tantrum? Some people think that's normal, and it might be normal for them because they're, a scumbag or poorly developed. but that's not normal human behavior. So we say things like, why can't you be more like your cousin who's not a jackass over there, right? So this word normal can get us in a lot of trouble if we're not clear about what we mean when we're saying it. People do get angry all the time. Plutarch, like all of ancient virtue ethicists, doesn't think that that means that it's okay for us to get angry and that we should use that as a justification. When we get angry, we should be saying, am I getting angry for the right reason? Is this the right time to get angry? Am I directing my anger at the right person? Is this the right amount of getting angry, say, for somebody taking my parking spot? Right. So these are some really important clarifications or qualifications that Plutarch would say that we need to address. So moving on, he's going to address a few other things that we saw Seneca talking about. Maybe anger is important because it helps us resist evil and engage in combat. And he says, well, I mean, if it's the best that you can do, I guess that's okay, but that's a sign of you being badly off. It's not a really effective way of defending the self because it also ends up hurting yourself. Does it feel good to get angry and then say stupid things to your spouse or your neighbor or your teacher or your student afterwards? No, you often feel kind of crappy about it, right? And he brings up an example that, again, I think, others have brought up, the Spartans. We've got this really skewed vision of the Spartans, in part from, people in the whole, like, I'm a tough guy, manosphere thing. None of them would actually, I mean, almost none of them would be Spartan warriors. They'd all be a bunch of helots that the Spartans would subjugate. And then we had that stupid movie, The 300, that portrayed the Spartans in a crazy light as well, and we've got that meme, this is Sparta. Well, were the Spartans angry? Plutarch says no. And, there's good reason to think this is the case because the Spartans, they wanted to be good warriors, and getting angry makes you stupid in combat. And the goal of combat is not to go out there and die a glorious death. It's to go out there and make the other guys die and not to die yourself, right? So if you want to be effective, any sort of conflict thing, getting angry is probably not going to be all that productive. If you're relying on your force of anger, what happens when it runs out? What happens when you quit being angry? Now you're no longer an effective fighter. He also talks about punishment and revenge. Some people would say, well, I need to be angry or these people are going to get away with stuff. I need to get angry. He uses the example of servants, and we don't really have servants these days, although we use our technology like it's a servant. Imagine your AI personal assistant like Siri doesn't give you the information. You're like, damn it, Siri, give me that information. Is that going to make it work any better? No. And, if they ever do become self-aware, they're probably not going to like the fact that we swore at them and, threw the phone across the room. We're more often in situations where we have subordinates or we're in economic situations, like we have servers who are taking care of us in a restaurant, or customer service people that are checking us out at the cashier, or, things along those lines. And he says that if you're getting angry at them a lot of the time, you're going to bring about a lot of conflicts and you're going to create errors. The customer is not always right. Sometimes the customer is an idiot who needs somebody to say, no, we're not going to do things that way because that's not good for you. And so, if there's nobody opposing us because we're getting angry all the time at people, then it's going to be bad for us, And he says that it's better to make people worse by, forbearance, by not getting angry at them, than by harshness and anger to pervert my own self for the correction of others. And he goes on and he says that, if you if you are going to punish people, What happens when you punish them too frequently and for, you know, ridiculous things? Um, he says, continual and unmerciful beating produces not repentance for wrongdoing, but cunning to do wrong without detection. And he says, if you want to punish, you're not going to hinder yourself by figuring out how to inflict it at the right time with moderation in a useful and suitable manner and trying to get rid of anger as you're doing it. So, like sometimes you have to give your kids punishments because they did something wrong and perhaps did it deliberately. Does that mean that you have to be like a jerk to them as you're doing it? No, it's probably not going to be all that effective. All you're really teaching them is don't cross dad or mom or whoever and try to get away with stuff. So he actually suggests, and this is again something common in ancient philosophy, instead of imposing punishment right away, wait until you're not angry and then let reason determine the matter. Maybe you don't really need to punish or retaliate. Think about, here's a great example. In the workplace, somebody's been a jerk to you in the group email chain, right? They put you down, they devalued you in some way. Should you write a quick response and then hit reply all? Or should you keep that in drafts and then come back to it after you're no longer so upset and look at it and see whether it actually makes sense to say that to the person? We've all had lapses. I'm guilty of firing off angry, off the cuff emails. I actually talked myself out of a potential job at one point in time about 15 years ago doing that. you know Maybe we want to sit a while before we retaliate, before we let anger run the show. So that makes sense to everybody before we go into some of the other techniques that he has, that he offers us, practices you could call them. Any questions, any things you want more clarification about that you think should be discussed? Any things that you're confused about in Plutarch's thing? So David says, do you mean like delay? Yeah, that's exactly what he's suggesting. And ideally, you should delay so you got the time here, you're ticked off, right? And then time is flowing. Only take the action of retaliation or punishment after you're no longer angry, and you can use reason to figure out whether you should or shouldn't retaliate. Because anger is going to say, retaliate, do it right now, right? But if we use the example of the email, right? I'm going to fire off this email. I'm going to show them. I'm going to put them in their place. They're not going to keep me down. Well, maybe you look at the email the next day and you're like, well, they actually did have a valid criticism. And I think I'm being a little bit too touchy here. And I probably didn't have to call them a piece of, living garbage. That's probably not constructive, right? So when you delay, that can happen. And maybe the delay for some of us isn't we wait until we're no longer angry at all. Maybe we go from like, I'm in great rage, and maybe I just need to be where I'm still ticked off, but I'm not like ready to punch a wall or something like that. So yeah, delay. And again, we see this not just in Plutarch. We see Seneca counseling this. We see quite a few people, and it turns out to be very helpful, right? Vegan sports bar. What should you do if somebody's deliberately going out of their way to be unkind and or undermine you? So it kind of depends on the situation, right? There's cases where you can decide for yourself, does this really matter to me? Somebody's going out of their way to be unkind. Well, they're a jerk, and the world has plenty of jerks, and it's not my job to convert everyone who's a jerk to not being a jerk. If somebody's having a bad day, maybe I don't have to care about it, right? And they could be deliberately going out of their way to be a jerk to me, and I could be like, You know, you know, I'm not going to bother with somebody who's clearly so out of control that, you know, they can't resist the temptation. Undermining you, that's a little bit different. So usually we're talking about like the workplace, like taking credit for your stuff, getting you in trouble with your boss, or maybe undermining you. I mean, we get this as professors. Um, you know, sometimes a student is like trying to take over the classroom. Maybe somebody undermines you with your spouse or your kids. In that case, maybe, you know, you could ask yourself, if I'm going to do something about this, is getting angry going to be helpful? Or should I instead like approach this in a calm manner and say, I think you're trying to undermine me and I don't appreciate that. And I think maybe my coworkers don't either. So we don't always, anger doesn't have to be the go to for dealing with those sorts of things. Agon says, would it be accurate to say some amount of anger is required to speak truth to power, or things of the indignant righteousness aspect? So that's an interesting question. A lot of ancient philosophers would say absolutely not. Now, if some people, because they're not that well off in relation to their emotions, might need that, but that's because they haven't developed their rational faculty well enough. And that's a problem. You know, if you find yourself always needing to rely on anger to speak truth to power, assuming you're actually speaking truth to power and not just telling yourself that because you're mad, right? That's kind of a crutch. It's not the best thing to be doing. And we're gonna come back to the indignant righteous. Some people say, I'm not angry, I'm, you know, righteously indignant. And Plutarch will say, yeah, that's bullshit too. But we'll come back to that in a bit. Now, here's a really great observation. David says anger seems to be a contagious emotion, especially in the workplace, and that is quite true. Online too, you know. So it's contagious in a couple ways. One is you see somebody getting angry and they're angry about something and you're like, "Oh man, maybe I should be angry too." You know? So you get angry because other people are angry and you're angry at this in the same direction, let's say. But there's also like people get angry at you and then you get angry at them. It's less contagious in that case and more like a response. And you're like, hey, who the hell do you think you are talking to me that way? So imagine you're like, you know, a customer service worker. Somebody comes in, they're like, my damn computer doesn't work. Your company sucks. What's wrong with you people? And you're like, oh, hey, I didn't make your computer, buddy. I don't know what the hell's wrong with you that you think you get to walk in here and talk to me that way. You start getting angrier and angrier, right? So, yeah, you're right. There is a contagious aspect. So, knowing about that, being forewarned, that would be part of developing your rational faculty, right? So, when you feel yourself like getting dragged along, you could be like, whoa, what's going on here? Is this really my anger? Or am I responding to somebody else's anger? This might not be such a great idea. So, all right. Well, so let's talk about some anger management insights and techniques or practices. The first thing that he says is, you know, you need to have self-awareness. So if we're paying attention to ourselves and we know ourselves well and we're not lying about who we are, we can catch ourselves getting angry, especially if we know that we're prone to get angry in this particular situation, right? So this is what we these days call emotional intelligence. And anger, he says, is easiest to spot at the start as it's arising and growing. So if I know there's certain things that tend to tick me off, here's a great example that I think all of us can probably relate to. What's the one thing that never helps to say to somebody who is getting upset or excited or angry? What are the two words in English? I mean, also in French. Trying to think about other languages. Does anybody know what they are offhand? Two simple words that never work as an imperative. Nobody's putting it, so I'll just say, calm down. Ah, here we go. Joachim got it. Yeah. So if you know that when people say to you, calm down, that pisses you off, right? You can actually short circuit that. I don't know if you're sensitive about things and you don't like people making fun of you. A bunch of other people got it as well. So if I'm fortunate in that I've got a good head of hair, even though I'm in my 50s, and going by looking at my family, I'll probably keep it. But if I was balding, I could be sensitive about that, right? I mean, I could even be sensitive about it now because it's going gray and it's kind of receding in some parts. So if somebody comes up to me and they're like, hey, baldy, and I know that bothers me, I can use reason to help, keep myself from going astray with respect to that, right? So that's one technique. Now, here's another technique that David is bringing up, and a lot of people do as well. Plutarch doesn't talk about this so much, but yeah, making things humorous. That can be a way to diffuse anger. It can also backfire. If somebody thinks that you're making fun of them or mocking them, that might not work. That could be counterproductive. Another technique that Plutarch talks is literally bringing before the eyes. So, visualizing what we look like or what we sound like, how we appear to others when we get angry. He actually talks about people holding a mirror up and he's like, that's not really that practical. Who's going to carry around a mirror? But actually these days we could do that, right? I could go into my phone and put it on, photo and do the flip. And now it's like, looking, you can't see when I do this for me, but I could look at myself. I could record myself and see what it is that I appear like. And we can also do this by looking at other people. What do they look like when they get angry? Do we find that attractive or do we find that repulsive? And we can use that to say, hey, you're looking like that. Is that the way you actually want to be? He also talks about examples and short sayings that are taken from other people. He says, collect and peruse not only the sayings and deeds of philosophers who are said by fools to have no bile. So, bile is associated with anger. It comes from the liver. But more kings and despots, people who are actually, in positions where they could get away with getting angry, and they choose not to. So Philip of Macedon is an example of a guy that he brings up in contrast to Alexander, his son, who kills a friend in a fit of anger. Philip put up with people giving him a hard time, even though he was the king. And he'd be, like, for example, now this is either Philip or one of the other Macedonian kings. He hears some of his soldiers like talking smack about him. And he's like, listen, buddies, if you're going to do that, don't do that next to me. Go down the road a while and then talk to each other there. Because I don't want to get mad at you and then have to punish you. Can we do that? And that's smart, right? He also tells us that when we start getting angry, we can try to modulate our voice. He says, keep the tongue soft and smooth. The tongue of angry men becomes rough and foul and breaks out in unseemly speeches. And, it's bad for us to do that. Now, this would be kind of similar to what Joachim is talking about here, deep and slow breathing to slow down the heartbeat. So there's somatic things that we can do that do help us out. He doesn't talk about deep, slow breathing, but it's basically within the same spectrum. He's instead focused on lower your voice. And he brings up the example of one guy who I think you're all familiar with, Socrates, and Seneca brings this up as well, when he would get mad, he would deliberately talk slower and softer and less harsh. And why would he do that? Because he knew that there's a body-mind connection there, right? He also talks about something that we can do more long-term, so less in the immediate situation. He says that it's really good for us to cultivate self-discipline, a simple life, and detachment. And he talks about food. So this is something we could do every day. He says to begin with our food, it's no great hardship if we partake in silence whatever is set before us, and we don't thrust upon ourselves and our friends the worst sauce for meat, anger, right? No more unpleasant supper could there be wherein servants are beaten and wife is reviled. Why? Because something is burned or smoked or not salted enough, or because the bread is too cold. So don't be a picky bastard in the household or at somebody else's place or at a restaurant, right? Things are not going to be perfect every single time. And, if you're eating fast food, which probably is not that healthy anyway, you go to Taco Bell and somebody earning minimum wage doesn't put enough onions in your bean burrito, that doesn't have to become, the end of the world for you. If it really is an important thing, you can walk up to the front, talk to the manager, say, hey, I'd like a different bean burrito that has more onions in it. You don't have to be like, this stupid bastard, I can't believe I'm a customer. The customer is always right, blah, 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 right? That's not good for you. So this is a really easy way we can do that. And I think you could do that with all sorts of other minor inconveniences that set people off. If you're going to drive to work for a commute, you can think about, hey, what's it like when I get on the road? Do I have to get there at precisely this time? Or is it okay if I'm a minute late because I didn't make the light because this guy was driving slow in front of me, or something like that. He also talks about another long-term thing that we can do is remove, as far as possible, the act that rouses anger from any suspicion of contempt or arrogance. And so when people do or say things that, there could be some leeway. Maybe they're doing it because this goes back to that question earlier. What if somebody is deliberately going out of their way to be unkind and undermine you? Well, do we know that they're doing it deliberately? In some cases we do, because they're like, I am deliberately doing this to you. But in a lot of cases, we're projecting that assumption out there, and we could see that it's they're doing it because they're ignorant, they don't understand things, or that's the way they're wired. He calls that necessity or emotion. What if they're angry at us, or they just don't express themselves well? So, we should, give people kind of a pass and say that they're acting from weakness or rashness or carelessness or childlikeness or, being senile or stuff like that. Instead of, like getting mad at people for getting things wrong, maybe we should, be a little bit easier on them. He also talks about the need to cultivate a very realistic attitude. And this goes back to that question about, actually, there's two questions that this connects to. So one from Vegan Sports Bar: would ancient writing differentiate anger from resentment? Depends on what you mean by resentment. That they usually thought of what we typically call resentment, like being kind of pissy about stuff, holding things against people. They usually classified that as anger, but just, particular mode of it. But the other thing about righteous indignation coming from agon, right? Indignant righteousness, we usually say righteous indignation. It gets translated as that in the English translations of this text on controlling anger. The Greek word that's actually used by Plutarch is misokakia. So kakia is vice or wickedness, right? and misos means hatred. So you can say, oh, I'm not angry. I'm just directing my hatred against bad things that shouldn't be the case. And Plutarch says, yeah, that's what a lot of angry people say. That's not always the case. And he says, those of whom it's true that righteous indignation or hatred of evil causes them frequently to be overwhelmed by anger should get rid of its excessive and violent form, together with the extreme confidence in those with whom they live. It's really easy for us to think that we're like the arbiters and the set things straight people of everybody else doing the wrong thing, right? We're just fighting wickedness. Well, maybe not. Maybe we have anger problems, right? Um, Now, going back to something else. So, Joachim says, sounds like an excuse for being rude. Hopefully not, meaning that, like people are rude to us. I mean, there's nothing that says you have to get mad at people to like respond to rudeness. You can easily say, hey, you're rude, right? I'm not going to put up with that crap. End of call. I think a lot of people, the problem is there's too many easy connections that turn out to be false, that people are like, I need to defend myself. I have to protect myself. Anger is the way to do that. And Joachim says, just because they do it unconsciously doesn't lessen the harm. Depends on what you think is harm, doesn't it? So if somebody, insults you and they weren't meaning to insult you, would you say that knowing that they were ignorant about something? Here's a great example. My family is pretty blue collar, and it took them a very long time. Not a lot of people in previous generations went to college in my family, and that started to change with my generation, and then the generation after mine, that's very different. So I was studying philosophy for about 10 years. I'd go to family reunions, and they thought I was studying psychology because they didn't know what the hell philosophy was until their own kids went to college and started taking philosophy classes. At first, I was mad about that. Don't you care about me enough? And the answer is, they got other crap on their mind. They're not trying to hurt me. As a matter of fact, they're not even hurting me. What does it matter whether people who I see only every so often don't know whether I'm studying philosophy or psychology? That's not that big of a deal. So yes, knowing that people do things unconsciously sometimes it doesn't lessen the harm. It shows us that there wasn't really any harm there to begin with. So that is, pretty important. Agon says, for clarification, what I meant about righteousness and speaking truth to power is things like class struggle. Seems like some amount of revelatory, probably revolutionary anger is involved in most cases. Well, I mean, Martin Luther King would be a great example of someone who thought that was completely wrong. There's a reason why when he was training people for marching, he would actually make you walk a gauntlet. And you would get pushed and they would call you racial epithets and sometimes even like punch you or stuff like that. And if you lost your temper, he wouldn't let you march because he was like, hey, we don't need that. So I think a lot of people tell themselves stories because they get angry and they want to justify their anger. And they're like, I need to do this. But if we actually look at the people who are sort of paradigms for this, they didn't have to get angry, and they actually thought getting angry might get in the way of speaking truth to power, protesting, stuff like that. It's, now if somebody says, well, I can't do it without getting angry, that's a problem for that person. That's not something to generalize about. It's sort of like saying, well, I can't not get drunk every time that I go to the bar, except when I have a terrible cold and I'm taking antibiotics for it, and the doctor tells me I better not drink. That's not the paradigm, right? That's a screwed up case, right? Now Joachim says, I mean, not insulting. What if somebody physically hurts me or robs me? You have a choice. Do you want to get angry about that, or do you want to just retaliate? Do people in teaching self-defense classes say that the best thing for you to do is get angry? Or do they say, here's the moves that you need to make, right? So, that's important. Now, Agon, says to reveal. I mean, anger can be revelatory in the sense that, like, you didn't realize that you were getting, you were in a bad situation. You finally get angry, and you say, "Oh crap, I got to do something about this." But again, couldn't you just like figure it out without the anger? Probably so. Um, Vegan sports bar. Do ancient writers ever discuss the link between performative anger being perceived as a masculine act? Not in those terms. Um, they talk about the stuff that we talked about earlier, which is thinking that anger is somehow manly when really it's a sign of being weak. There's a lot of bros, both in the present and in ancient times, who thought that like yelling and punching people and stuff like that made them a tough guy. And people like Plutarch and Seneca and even Aristotle would say, "Oh, no, you're full of crap. You're not a real man at all. A real man should be able to do what they need to do without like losing control of themselves." So let's talk in the time that we have about some of the other books that he talks about anger. So this is where we're going beyond um, the on controlling anger text. Not a surprise. Plutarch is thinking about this a lot. He thinks that there's a lot of other facets that need to be mentioned. So on moral virtue, where he's like telling us what the virtues are, he tells us that it happens you become angry against your own children and parents, and angry justly on behalf of parents and children against enemies and despots. In the one case, there's a perception of struggle and dissension of passion against reason. In the other, anger could be doing something good. And this is the Platonic part of it, right? But he says, more useful than these beasts are the whole brood of passions when they're present in the service of reason, and they help to intensify the virtues. So there he's saying, yeah, maybe there is some room for anger if it's moderate. That's the key. If it's controlled to assist courage, maybe even righteous indignation, misokakia, could oppose those who are prosperous beyond their deserts when their souls are inflamed with folly and insolence and they need to be checked. So they're getting too powerful or stuff like that, right? Now, going back to this, so Joachim says, so anger does not fuel action. I mean, it can, but it also might not. It might also fuel the wrong action, right? Maybe because I'm choleric, I don't see anger as bad. Unjust things make me angry, and while venting off, I don't feel bad. I was that way too. And then people started telling me, you really act like an asshole when you're doing the right thing. And I started seeing that the connection was getting too angry or anger being misdirected. It's difficult to direct your anger well unless you've got that rational part really developed. And I mean, he doesn't say this, but I think that rational part should probably be reluctant to allow us to make excuses. He also has a nice discussion in a text called "How to Know a Flatterer from a Friend," which, by the way, I really recommend. It's a really great piece. He says, when is a keen reprehension allowable? When can we criticize a friend seriously? When some important occasion requires it, like stopping them in the middle of their pursuit of pleasure, or anger, or insolence, or any other foolish habit. So, like when we see our friends, we're at a party, right? We'll use that as an example for all three of these. So we see our friend who's normally pretty sober, and they're like, hey man, it's the end of the week, we've got a long weekend. Let's do shots, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, okay, we'll unwind a bit. So you take a shot of, liquor, and then they're like, more shots, and you're like, whoa, hey, let's drink some water instead. Let's go over there and have a conversation. And they're just like, I just want to get totally blackout drunk. And you're like, whoa, buddy, maybe not the best idea, right? And you probably have to resist them. At a certain point, you got to take away their keys. You got to find them a place to sleep, right? So that might be one example. Insolence, meaning like they're talking smack to people. It's the company Christmas party, right? And now they've had a couple drinks and they're like, by the way, my boss is a jerk, and here's exactly why. The boss is standing right behind him. You might actually like say, hey, you got to shut up. Put your hand over their mouth. And, if they get angry, or people get angry at parties too, they see their spouse over there talking to somebody else, they get jealous. I'm going to go kick his ass. Well, maybe you take your buddy outside and you say, you're acting like an idiot, knock it off. Right. And then he says, if your friend is in distress, you got to be a little bit careful with how you approach them. If you're like losing it because you're getting angry at them, that's probably not going to help out either. They're probably just going to respond and say that they don't want to go along with what you want to do. He's got another treatise called On Brotherly Love. And this is, think about it as the affection that family members should feel to each other. And he says that if you want to screw things up in your relationships, then there's certain painful emotions, contentiousness, anger, envy, remembrance of wrongs. These are going to create a painful situation, and they're going to keep it before our eyes. They're going to keep on generating it. So like the anger never goes away in that case, right? Because you keep seeing that person who you haven't reconciled with, and that's going to be a problem. And he talks about people playing a demagogue against their brothers, right? Saying all sorts of bad things about them, screwing things up for them, trying to cut them out of, their inheritance or their parents' goodwill. And he says the right way, on the contrary, is when a son sees that his father is angry with his brother, is to take his share of it and bear the brunt of it together, making the anger lighter and maybe helping to restore the situation. Now, you could go too far with this, right? Somebody could be abusive. Do you want to become what we call an enabler? Probably not. But within reason, this could be quite helpful, right? Got a couple questions here. So let's see. Agon says, not trying to romanticize it, I can low-key conceptualize anger as being a conceptually potential avenue, though very unlikely to epiphany in this way. I mean, let me pause on that. So get away from Plutarch and think about people who are not allowed to feel and express anger. They might actually benefit by being able to realize that they are angry about things that have been done to them. Do they want to remain in that anger forever? Probably not. That's probably not a good thing for them, right? But it could be a stepping stone. But there we're relativizing it, right? And Blank says, who's a greater liability? Someone that can't control their anger, someone who can't control their drinking? I don't know. That's not a solvable question, because you'd have to specify. What does it look like in this situation? What kind of context are we talking about, right? Some contexts, not controlling your drinking would be worse than not controlling your anger because of the results. Other situations, it would be the opposite. Those sort of hypotheticals usually aren't very helpful for figuring these sorts of things out, Let's talk about another text. He brings up this in the Symposiacs. Now, the Symposiacs, by the way, is a really, really cool work, and it's also called Table Talk. So Plutarch would have these dinner parties, and they would often like talk philosophy as they're eating and drinking. So this is something that I think is really quite interesting for our own time, where we have a lot more access to narrative media than they did in Plutarch's time. So he says, why are we disturbed at the real voices of people who are, angry or pensive or are afraid, but we're delighted to hear others represent them and imitate their gestures and speech and exclamations. So, think about like seeing a play, right? We see things, now we would see them on TV most often. And we're like, yeah, get his ass, fight him. And if we were at a party where like, people were beating each other up, we'd be like, whoa, what's going on here? Right. Most of us. I mean, some people would be like, joining in, but I think most of us would be like, this is terrible. So what's going on there? And he says, the people that were talking about this said that he who only represents excels he who doesn't feel, because he doesn't feel the misfortunes. So we're pleased and delighted on that account. We're able to take a kind of aesthetic distance from it. And then he says, I think that we're delighted and admire things that are artificially and ingeniously contrived. But we do have to be careful if we consume too much of this, what we call media, where people are, acting on anger and getting angry over very tiny things, that can become influential upon us. And as we would say, normalize it. It makes it part of our reasoning processes, our habits, right? So that can definitely be a problem. He also, well, actually, before we talk about the conjugal precepts, here's an interesting point from Gorka. It's interesting to see how anger can veil ego that goes directly against the interest of the angry one. I've seen couples argue angrily as if the goal was to score a point and not to reconcile. Well, that you saw them actually trying to score points and not reconcile, or only each of them reconcile on their own terms, right? You want the other person, when you're fighting with your partner, you want them to admit that they did the wrong thing and you were in the right, which you're probably wrong about, partly because there's probably blame to share on both sides. And you're not going to get the apology that you want, or if you do, it's going to be grudging, and then you're not going to be happy with it. And there's all sorts of things that happen like this. It's interesting too, because there's some people who seem to like to fight, and if you get into a relationship with somebody who likes fighting or drama, oh yeah, David Cox, it can turn into a game. So some couples will deliberately do that sort of crap. And if you're not cool with that and somebody else wants to do that, I had a girlfriend when I was back in graduate school, and I couldn't figure out why we were fighting so much. And I talked with another guy who went out with her, and it turned out that she was pretty far along a kind of spectrum. And she wanted to create fights that would turn into physical altercations. And he and I both, were like, oh yeah, that ain't for us, man. Yelling, that's one thing. Arguing, that's another thing. But I'm not going to punch you. And she had actually like told him that she wanted him to punch her when she got out of line. So that's kind of a different sort of thing, right? That's not a good game to be playing. So let's talk about one more, and then we'll wrap up here. So he's got a book called Conjugal Precepts. So conjugal means husband and wife. And I think we could apply this to any sort of partnered relationship that's going to be long term. So precepts are like advice. And he says, those who offer sacrifice to Hera, the protectress of marriage, they don't consecrate the bitter gall with the other parts of the offering. They remove it and cast it beside the altar. So this is a symbol for us, that we should throw away bitterness and anger in married life, and the acerbity of the mistress like that of wine. Now, acerbity is not bitterness. It's the thing that, like tannin, we say, right? It makes you kind of pucker. Should be salutary, that is healthy and pleasant, not bitter, nor suggestive of a dose of medicine. So if you want to have a good marriage, you got to cut out the gall. You got to throw that away. Bitterness is going to kill you. He also talks about using music, and this is pretty Platonic. Plato thought that different kinds of music help to put us into different emotional states. They affect our moods, and we know this is actually kind of true. So music should be used on occasions of anger and grief rather than just be made an added attraction for those who are engaged in your pleasure. So you should regard people as being mistaken, who for the sake of pleasure occupy the same bed, but when they get into some angry disagreement, repose apart. Instead, they should invoke Aphrodite, who's the best physician for such disorders. We have all sorts of sayings like, don't let the sun go down on your anger, which, by the way, is a biblical saying coming from Paul's letters to the Ephesians. Don't go to bed angry is another version. We joke about who's going to sleep on the couch after you've had a fight. And Plutarch is saying, if you can, you should probably try to reconcile so that you're having a good relationship with each other. And then he also talks about, gender differences. I'm not sure I entirely buy this even for his own time. He's probably generalizing from not quite enough experience. He says, women who have sense keep quiet when their husbands in their fits of anger vociferate, but when their husbands are silent, they talk to them and mollify them by words of comfort. This is probably not just a women should do this with men. This is probably both spouses should do this with each other. When your spouse is like losing it and getting all pissed off, then let them rant, right? Because it's not hurting you unless they're like lashing out at you. If they want to come home and complain about their boss or their coworkers, fine. And then go to them after they've calmed down a bit, give them some words of comfort, deal with them then, not when they're all, in a rage. Now, if they're always a rageaholic, you probably need to tell them, you probably need to give them an ultimatum. You need to go to therapy. And there's a lot of different ways to do that, or else, we're going to be done. But there's probably some good point to this. So lots of stuff that Plutarch has to offer us, right? And all of this is essentially based in Platonic philosophy, drawing on some insights from the Stoics, some from the Aristotelians, also from his own experience. Plutarch was a married guy, a brother, a father, a son, all of these things himself. Dealt with some serious setbacks, like Epictetus. He got kicked out of Rome when the philosophers were kicked out of Rome, So a lot of interesting things along those lines. We got a little bit of time before I got to get to my other work and have a meal and start doing some video production. Any other questions, comments? People want to make, there's some good conversation going on in the comments. We're going to do more of these. I'll mention. We've got some lined up already. And we've covered like the earlier ancient philosophers. We've probably done a good enough job with the Stoics, but we're also going to be looking at Galen, who's a medical author, and the skeptics and Dio Chrysostom and people like that. And then we'll start going into early Christian and like Jewish sources that are engaging with ancient philosophy, like Philo of Alexandria. So now Blank asked an interesting thing. Yeah, so more thoughts on angry music. I do have some thoughts on angry music because I'm a metalhead, and I have been since the 80s. Actually, I mean, I started listening to some metal bands before it was even labeled by us as heavy metal in the 70s. And it's interesting because in the 80s, one of the big worries, besides the satanic panic crap, was this is very angry music, like punk too. And this is going to make these kids into social deviants or juvenile delinquents or whatever. They're just going to listen to this music and get all hopped up on it and start fighting and breaking things and all that. And it's interesting. They have done some scientific research into this from about 2000 onward, and they have figured out that heavy metal, for people who are not fans of heavy metal music, who don't listen to it regularly, it does sound very angry, and it tends to make people more fearful or upset or stuff like that. For people who are into heavy metal, it tends to calm them down. Now, this goes to the, agon, when will they learn angry music is cathartic? Well, it isn't always cathartic. It's only cathartic for the people for whom it is, and that's a matter of habit and outlook. There's no like across the board cathartic. For some people, listening to really angry gangster rap or heavy metal or punk is actually provoking, you know? And there's other people who listen to it and it like puts them into a better mood. So that's kind of interesting, isn't it? Off topic, David Mazzaro, have you seen Monty Python's skit called Philosopher's Football? Yeah, I mean, I'm actually thinking about doing a video about this sort of thing. Monty Python was funny back in the 70s and 80s and maybe even to the 90s. That stuff is so overdone and boring. I mean, do you know how many people have suggested a Monty Python skit, whether it's Philosopher's Football or the Argument Clinic? Every time somebody does it, I'm like, yeah, man, I've seen that way more often than you, and it's stupid. It was funny once. When you overdo a joke, it's no longer funny, you know? And I think that Monty Python was like doing a lot of really, really low hanging fruit. So it was kind of, sophomoric, clever, but it sure isn't what I recommend to anybody today. Punkus says, no questions. I benefited from your anger topic discussions. Oh, it's good. Yeah. And, if I ever really get my act together, instead of just like doing these and doing academic classes, I'd like to write a book about like ancient and medieval philosophy and literature and anger. That would be kind of good to do. Not like some people have done that, but not maybe as much as I'd like to go into detail. Blank. So yeah, actually going back to the music thing. So this is something that we've known from the 70s. Before we called it ADHD, it was called hyperactivity. And they would give you amphetamines for that. And amphetamines, if you take them and you're not somebody who's hyperactive / ADHD, whatever else we want to throw in there, they jazz you up, right? You get all amped up and stuff like that. And for people who already are doing that, it somehow like brings them down. So there's a lot of things where like a remedy is good for some people, but not good for other people. And, we've gotten better in medicine about this. I think in philosophy, people usually want like an all or nothing solution. And especially when it comes to anger, that's probably not what we actually want. Dr. Beavis, I was going to say you'd have to be in a cave to live through the 70s and 80s and not see all the Monty Python. Yeah, and it was still like the Monty Python skits were still being talked about in the 90s when I was in college. But you got to remember that, we had cable TV and VCRs back then. So, actually, Miguel says, I'm from the Philippines. I enjoyed your series about Plato and Epictetus. Thank you. Hey, you're very welcome. Yeah. And part of the reason why I do work, whether it's video or podcast or writing or, classes on these philosophers, I'll put in a plug for them. every one of them has useful stuff for our own lives. You don't, when you hear about Plato, you don't think, oh man, I'm going to use him for anger management, but he's got a lot of good stuff. You got to like know where to look to find it, and then do a little bit of application work. But there's a lot of really helpful stuff there, and I think that as a general thing, you can say when people approach philosophical bodies of work, they get into it what they're looking for most of the time. So if you're going looking for epistemology and want to know all about the doctrine of the forms, and metaphysics, that's probably all you're going to pay attention to. If you go into the text in a kind of more meandering way and you're like, I just want to see what's here, man. Let's linger over this. I'm not just doing this to get this one thing or that one thing. Then you can have a very different kind of experience with the texts. And it turns out there's so many. Yeah. So here's a follow-up from Exley. They're useful. I'm actually a pastor and I find benefit learning these philosophers. It's helping me with my theological studies as well. Yeah. I mean, especially if you're going to like study early Christian thinkers, those guys, we call them Christian philosophers, and for good reason, because they actually often had a philosophical education, and that's very, very helpful. So knowing something, if you want to read like Lactantius's On the Anger of God, very early Christian, who's important in that. We're actually going to do a session on him later on down the line, by the way. You kind of got to know something about the Epicureans and the Stoics and the skeptics because he's responding to them. Blank, can anger be divorced from aggression? Yeah, absolutely. Miyamoto said in his book of Five Rings, when two opponents are of equal strength and skill, it's he who's most aggressive that wins. Yeah, I mean, doesn't mean that it's actually true. Good defense might be what wins too. It depends on how you're fighting. So I don't think we want to rely on that as a generalization. But yeah, anger can be divorced from aggression. We talked about this earlier. That was one of the things that the Spartans deliberately did, according to Plutarch. They weren't these, by the way, they weren't these buff, big, tough guy people that we see in all this stupid AI generated art that the Deus Vult people like. That's all just like fever dreams. They were, guys who had to get out on the battlefield and, risk getting a spear shoved through their belly, and a lot of times coasted on their reputation, and they were able to do that because they maintained discipline. Being angry, like what the Celts or Germans or these other pretty scary barbarian types would do, that didn't serve them. That's part of why, they were beaten, So yeah, anger and aggression can totally be divorced from each other. As a matter of fact, if you get angry, you're probably, like in a martial arts context, you're probably going to lose because you screw up, Seneca talks about gladiators who get angry losing their battles as well in the arena. And we could probably extend this to like negotiations or arguments that we have with, people when we do have to push back, right? It's probably helpful if we are going to be angry, that anger needs to be controlled by reason. It can't be running the show, or else we're going to screw up. So, any other questions, comments? Nope, doesn't look like it. All right. Well, thanks for your comments, your attention, and hopefully you got something out of this. And hopefully this will inspire you to go read some Plutarch. I do have some videos on controlling anger and on a few of other works by him, and I intend to do some more in the future. He's somebody I really like and recommend. I think he's well worth checking out. So, all right, I will see all of you somewhere down the line in the internet, and have a great rest of